old friend Shava Narad was founding executive director of the TOR Foundation. TOR Project, a spin-off of the EFF.
Kind of, we'll talk about that.
And she will explain exactly what this means, because I'm not going to try to explain that alphabet soup. And I don't think either of us is going to admit how long we've had mutual friends.
Well, you know, at least one person here has known me for about 35 years, something like that. So we'll leave it at that. I've been around Boston a long time. Hi, my name's Shava Narad, and I have been I started out doing programming at Polaroid in Tech Square in 1978. So I've been around a while. And I was MIT staff in the 80s for a few years. And went off to North Carolina for 6 years and Oregon for 10 years, and then came back to Boston. And this is basically what I consider to be home. And I went to a few meetings of this group back in the 80s. So it's interesting to be back here.
Well, I could have been this group because we founded the group in 1994.
Oh, okay. Well, there was certainly a Unix group that met monthly.
Yeah, there was.
Over off the Infinite Corridor in the Campbell Soup Building.
They kind of went defunct.
Okay.
But since I knew you back around '82. So.
Yeah. So, at any rate, the TOR, does everybody know what TOR is? Is there anybody who needs a refresher on that? Okay, well, we'll go into this briefly. TOR is essentially, if you know what a proxy is, a proxy basically allows you to make an indirect link for your IP into sort of to carom off an intermediary to make an indirect link for your internet connection. And to put it very simply, what Tor does is it sends you through a bunch of tunneled, encrypted proxy connections such that nobody can see where you came from originally. And this is called anonymization. It doesn't have to do with having an anonymized identity like, something like 4chan where nobody knows what your username is. It has to do with anonymizing your IP. And the IP protocol was originally set up so that you knew where everybody was coming from. This was an important part of the protocol. So trying to set up something as an overlay on the IP protocol that causes a connection to be able to be set up so that you could obfuscate the origin of communication is actually what you might call a serious kludge. It's not easy to set up, and it's basically gives you a hit in performance and all this kind of thing. And so what you have is it's easier to do if you are willing to take really big hits in latency. If you want to do anonymous email, that's pretty easy because email is store and forward. So if you want to sit there and say, okay, we're going to make an anonymous email, then you can take the hit of, doing stuff that allows it to be a couple hours late and yada, 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 and the latency doesn't really matter because people usually are not that concerned about latency in email on a human scale. But if you're talking about stuff like web browsing and loading a web page, or God knows streaming media, then you've got a really different problem. You want your latency to be as low as possible, but yet you want that communication to be obfuscated. So Tor invented this way of basically doing this triple sheath of encryption so that the origin was always obscured. The content isn't obscured by Tor. If you don't use an end-to-end encrypted communication, your communication isn't obscured, and of course the Tor people recommend that you use end-to-end encryption. But Tor will obscure the origin, and it'll obscure everything from the origin to the place where you exit the Tor cloud of servers. But from there out, if it wasn't encrypted to begin with by you, it goes out of the Tor cloud in the clear. And that's where a lot of people in law enforcement actually end up catching people, because people will do things like they'll use protocols that carry the original IP in the content of the stream. Flash, PDF, and a few other clients are notorious for stuffing the originating IP address into the content of files or communications. And so you can use Tor all you want, but if you don't use end-to-end encryption and you use Flash or PDF generation, you're likely to be decloaked just by the fact that you sent one of those things across the link and didn't encrypt. So the Tor project has its very beginnings at the Naval Research Lab, the U.S. Naval Research Lab, with a mathematician named Paul Syverson. And Paul came up with this idea of doing this thing of putting the layers of encryption around the communication. And he decided he was going to call this onion routing. So the whole idea of doing this was called the onion router, therefore Tor. And he actually was issued a patent on this, the way he originally set up to do it. And he found two young doctorate candidates here at MIT, Nick Mathewson and Roger Dingledine, and said, okay, you guys, we will throw you some money from the Naval Research Lab for you to implement this thing. And they sat there and said, wow, that's a really interesting concept. It's really too bad that you are not a programmer and you're a mathematician, and your idea of how to implement this completely sucks.
That sounds like a programmer.
And so what ended up happening was that they completely threw out his patented method of actually implementing this. And this is why Tor is no longer an acronym, but is just T, capital T, small o, small r, because they completely scrapped the patent and all of the stuff that the Navy owned out of the thing. They completely rewrote it from the ground up, using some of the conceptuals that came out of the Navy Research Lab, and wrote this thing called Tor. It was two guys originally, just these two doctoral students, and then it turned into an open source project with contributors from all over the world, communicating basically through an IRC channel and a wiki, and basically ticketing system and so on. And that was it. There was no money involved. And then, except for, there was like a year worth of money from the couple, or maybe a couple of years of money through the Naval Research Lab. Yeah, you can feel.
What was the year about when the?
Yeah, this is like 2004 that Paul comes up with the idea. By late 2005, the guys graduate they're out of money, and EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is like sort of the ACLU for digital rights, comes up and sits there and says, oh my God, you guys want to do this and you have no money, and we want to see this thing actually do something. So we will give you 1 year of money. We usually take money from people. We don't usually give people money. But we do not want you guys to fall on your asses and have to go do something else. So we will give you 1 year worth of money to keep this thing going, and you guys find your next money, because this is all we do. This is it, you know, this is 1 year limited grant. And they said, cool. And so they went to open source conferences, and they went to hacker conferences, and they said, give us money, we're doing this cool thing. And the hacker conferences and the open source conferences said, wow, really cool thing. Why we don't give people money? What? And so at the end of the year, Nick went to go work for PGP, actually, and Roger was consulting part-time. He's absolutely, is that door open?
Yeah.
Yeah. Roger went to work for you know, little contracting things and everything. He was working himself to death, basically, trying to keep the project from falling apart. The problem with an open source project that's crypto is that you can't just leave it to open contribution. You know, it's not like, and I think this might be some of the problems that some of our recent last year's projects ran into. You just can't let everybody, you know, dip their fingers into the code store and contribute things. It has to be essentially tightly throttled at the code store, so that people really understand what all the code is doing. And so Nick and Roger had to look at every line of code that got contributed and proposed. And it made it very difficult. You know, they had different people doing interface layers and things like that, but anything that was at the kernel of the project, the two of them were very close to the guts of the thing and the actual crypto and operational bits. So it was really kind of killing them, and they were out of money, and they ran into me. And I'm sort of, at this point, more of a manager than much of a hacker in my own career. And as a matter of fact, when Nick first saw my resume and it had things like VP of Marketing on it, he decided that he hated me without ever meeting me. But I actually became a marketing person out of self-defense, because marketing people had this tendency to oversell development groups. And one development group I worked with gave me the unofficial job title of speaker to animals, because I was the person who talked to the executives and to the marketing group, and, you know, basically was the diplomat that kept people off their backs. And when I had a kid, I sort of jumped the fence. My son said, my mom used to be an engineer, but now she works in marketing. You know, she's gone over to the dark side. So Roger and I met under curious circumstances I won't go into, and he decided I might be the person who they could actually trust to raise money and do the bean counter side of getting Tor up and running. I had experience in governmental grants and nonprofit fundraising and organization. And so Nick was in town, coming from California, met me, went, oh my God, you're a chameleon. I like you. You know, you can do this suit stuff, and you're one of us, and it's cool. So we I basically told them that there were a couple things, if we were going to do this, that they had to agree to. One was, they stopped talking to the press because they sucked at it. And any press contacts had to go to me. The other was that we were going to be a U.S. nonprofit organization. They were talking about if they were going to be a nonprofit organization incorporating in Amsterdam, and I sat there and said, no, we get to incorporate here for a variety of reasons. And the other thing was I was going to be the executive director. It didn't mean that Roger wasn't running the show, but I needed that title to get access to the people I needed to get access to raise the money. And they sat there and said, if it works, then let's do it. And so we incorporated, for those of you who understand how significant this is, we got our nonprofit status in under 90 days.
Woo.
Yeah. I have good 1023 food. We got a board up and running, all this kind of stuff, and one of the problems we had was that the tour project, if you looked at the SEO for the tour, it looked like a total ugly black hat, nasty tool, which makes it very hard to raise money. And so one of the first things I did as executive director is I took a physical trip up and down the East Coast to organizations that I had had prior contacts with for the most part. And I went to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, a number of press protection groups, various and sundry, and just basically went to New York and Washington and a couple other places and sat down with people and said, I know that you use TOR to protect human rights workers, to protect journalists in the field, whatever it was that they were doing with it, and I need your help. And they said, well, we can't give you money or anything. And I was like, no, I don't need that kind of help. What I need you to do is I need you to start mentioning TOR in your newsletters, in your annual report. Talk about how you're using it, talk about how it protects journalists, how it protects human rights workers, how it protects people in distress, women in domestic abuse situations, whatever it is that you're using it for. And just put it out there, in whatever context you're putting it out there on the web too. And they said, oh, well, we can do that, if that's all you need. So within 3 to 6 months, all of these nasty black hat uses, and there are nasty black hat uses for TOR, there's no question about it, it's a tool. Any software tool can be used for nasty things as well as good things. Got buried under these things that made TOR look like what it was that I took the job. This is why I took the job as executive director, because TOR is a tool that does help human rights workers, democracy activists, union organizers, people who are helping people in bad situations like domestic abuse victims, journalists in the field in places like Somalia or Jordan or all of these different places, Reporters Without Borders, blah, 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 all of these sort of things. And all of a sudden, we looked like the champion of all, apple pie, blah, 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 blah. It was great. It was awesome. And so within 6 months after taking over as the executive director of the project, we had 7 healthy figures in the pipeline of funding coming in from nothing. And I don't think that there's very many open source software projects that can say that they would have something like that. And our major funder that year was the people who do Voice of America for the US government, who are actually a nonprofit. They are actually not the government. They are actually a nonprofit which is funded by the US government. They were in favor of funding us because it was by using Tor that people in China were getting out of the Great Firewall of China to get at the web information for the Voice of America stuff that was being fed into China. At the same time, by the way, the Beijing Bureau for CNN and for National Public Radio were using Tor to get their reports out of China so that they could file their stories from the Beijing Bureau out. So, you know, things coming in and out of China were going through Tor. China had the capacity to shut Tor down, but they didn't do it. And at one point I got interviewed by Al Jazeera about this. And they sat there and said, well, you know, how do you feel about this, you know, national firewalls, blah, 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 blah. And I sat there and said, well, China doesn't shut us down. They could technically they have the capacity to do it, but they don't do it. And the reason that they don't do it is that we are like the valve on a pressure cooker. They're trying to turn into a commercial economy as fast as they can. And the capitalist elites in the PRC need a way to access information that they don't want to make widely available to everybody. But they figure if people are sophisticated enough that they're going to know about and be able to use Tor to get to Bloomberg News and the Wall Street Journal and whatever, then they probably are people who should be getting to that information and need to have that information. And so we figure that they appreciate our place in their ecosystem. And it was really funny because most of the people who do what's called circumvention software, because they're doing ways to get around national firewalls, are like, oh yes, national firewalls are evil! And we were like, no, we figure that they appreciate our function in their system, or they would be shutting us down. They could do it. It was really funny.
Have you got something funny?
I don't think that they would go that far. Yeah, it's very funny. It's a delicate diplomatic thing. One of the reasons, honestly, that I wanted us to incorporate in the U.S. has turned out to be prophetic, because one of the things that I appreciate about the U.S. is that we are a contentious people. And right now, a good deal of Tor's funding is coming from the State Department, from the Internet Freedom Initiative at the U.S. State Department. And the NSA, some of you may have seen some of the stuff in the Snowden leaks. They had a little PowerPoint presentation entitled Tor Stinks. It's talking about how they were unable to break Tor, and they would like to. Now, I will lay you bets. In 2007, Roger went to the NSA and gave a presentation there about how Tor works, which is about the same time that that presentation was given. You know, we go and tell anybody who asks us, and we will give them help who is in the government or not in the government, you know? But we have always had good relations with people in law enforcement, in NGOs, whatever. And those people use Tor. There are people in every branch, I'm sure, of the intelligence community, in justice, in local police groups, wherever. We know that they're using Tor for their work. If you are trying to do a sting operation on people who are luring little girls in chat rooms or something like that, and your IP traces back to ny.us, you're not going to get a very good sting going on, right? So using Tor to obscure your origin of your IP is a good idea if you're doing police work. You know, it's just as good for investigations as it is for the criminals. And that's why, you know, the Navy originally invented it so that their MI folks in the field could phone home, as it were, over the open internet without betraying their origin. But Tor leaves a signature, so if it was only US military using it, then people could sit there and say, oh, look, they're using that software, it's US military. So they gave it out as open source so that they'd have all of us as chaff, right? You know, and they knew everybody would be using it. But that's okay, because tools used by everybody keeps the internet open and free. You know, you don't slit open every piece of mail because somebody might be writing something nasty in the mail. You know, this is a principle that we've had in this country in general for a couple hundred years. And well before Judge Brandeis started codifying the right to privacy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, you know, as the right to be left alone, as it were. But it was much more social than that, really, the way he brought the decisions down. And so, you know, we consider, I would say, you know, I mean, I can't speak for the project, I can't speak for the current funders or the current administration of the Tor project, but certainly when I got involved with it, my thought was that this is something which was a civil liberties project. Very much so. And it's kind of interesting when you see what's going on now, to see, you know, sort of state and the NSA spitting like cats across the mall at each other, right? Because people sit there and say, oh, the government thinks this, and I'm like, no, the government never thinks anything, because our government exists to be at contention with itself. That's what our democracy is designed in its original documents to actually promote. And if we were in Amsterdam at this point, the US would have shut us down. You know, we'd be like operating out of a closet in the Ecuadorian embassy someplace. It would not have been fun. But because we are incorporated in America, we are freely operating at this point. Many things have operated through the Tor project. The activists for the Arab Spring in Tahrir Square were using Tor. The headlines in the news said that they were organizing on Facebook, but if they were organizing on Facebook without obfuscating the origin of their communications, in most of those sort of countries, the telecommunications companies are either owned by the government or in the hip pocket of the governments. And so the organizers' Facebook IDs would have, and communications would have been traced. People would have been rounded up the first day and jailed, tortured, or disappeared. It just would have been that fast. Mubarak wouldn't have hesitated. And so it was because of Tor that these people did not basically have a very short career in activism, let's say. When earlier than that, and this was during my tenure, when there was the coup in 2006 in Thailand, there was a military coup. And 3 months prior, I'd been interviewed by the editor of The Economist, the financial magazine in the UK. And so I get called up, I believe it was rather early one morning, by the executive editor of The Economist. And he sits there and says, "I beg pardon, but do you have a volunteer in Bangkok?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm sure we have somebody there. What's happening?" And they said, "Well, you know, we've got this coup there, and we've got a reporter, and he's something of a Luddite." And so he goes on to explain to me, if anybody has ever seen the movie My Year of Living Dangerously, all of the reporters in that movie were living in this one hotel in downtown Bangkok. That's actually how the reporters are in Bangkok still. They all live in this one hotel in downtown Bangkok. And so the reporter from The Economist was having problems because Thailand does own the national telecoms. And so every time a reporter filed a story about the coup, two strapping, very clean-cut, young, burly men would come knocking on the reporter's door and say, "Ah, we just noticed you filed a story on the coup. Have a very, very fine evening, sir." And they'd shut the door and just stand there for a little bit and then vaguely wander off after a little while. And it was what we call a chilling effect. You know, because these young men were military, they were fully armed, they were steelily cordial. So we got somebody in Bangkok to go over to this place, and not only did they fix up the guy from The Economist, but they got all of the reporters down into this little salon down in the area of the hotel, and basically handed out thumb drives with Tor, and I think this was before Tails, but it was something pre-Tails. But it was like a bootable implementation. So that they could just sit there and boot something up and send off their stuff with a secure, clean implementation straight off to wherever they had to go. So, and you know, when you send stuff with Tor from the origin, it's encrypted anyway. So it went out encrypted over the wire. 3 months later, the Bangkok Times, which is an English language newspaper in Bangkok, published a story where they did a kid on the street interview. And they found a couple little boys, well, not little boys, teenage boys who were at a cyber cafe. And at that point, there were actually official censorship rules that had been put in Bangkok Thailand. And they said, well, how do you feel about the censorship rules? Aren't you worried about what you say on the internet? And they said, no, none of us pay any attention to that. We all use Tor. And they pulled out thumb drives, which were probably exact copies of the thumb drives that we had left with the journalists. And these had apparently spread around like wildfire all around Bangkok and probably quite much further around Thailand. So, this had turned into a thing in Thailand within a couple months, where people were like, we aren't afraid of the government, we don't take it seriously, we just basically, we use this tool. That's it. So this is the good side. The bad side is that there is a great deal of intentional disinfo spread around Tor, particularly these days in the Middle East. And some of that is spread by our own government. And I'm very sad about that. And, there is my second least favorite, September 11th was spent when the week after a young man in Germany got his computer seized as part of a sting in Munich because there was a seizure of, I think it was about 150 computers as part of a child pornography sting. And he was running a Tor exit node and his computer got seized. And a friend of ours who was a lawyer, a friend of the project who was a lawyer in Germany, went down to the police department and found out it was like just one of 150 computers with an IP that had been traced as having had child porn relayed through it. And of course, if you're running a Tor exit node, you can't control what gets bounced through you, right? It could be anything. It's like what gets looked up at a public access library terminal. You can't really control what goes through there. And so, but unfortunately, the young man was very shaken about it. He blogged about it in English, and his English was not very good. And so his machine was seized on Thursday. On Friday, he blogs about it and he says, my machine is seized for child pornography, which, it wasn't. There was no child pornography on it. But, the sting was for child pornography. So my machine is seized for child pornography, for being a Tor exit node, and I am afraid I will end up going to court and I lose my machine, and yada, yada, yada. And somebody from Slashdot sees this blog article, freaks out that Germany is going to shut down the Tor network. Slashdot's the story on Sunday, and rather late on Sunday, Boing Boing picks it up. And so here we are thinking, here we are with this like rather horrible child pornography story, but nobody's going to ever know about it. And thank God. And it's the people, sometimes your friends are your worst enemies, because these people who are sitting there going, we have to save the Tor project from being shut down by Germany, are the people who completely blew up this story from something that was actually no threat to us whatsoever into something which made us sound horrible, completely horrible. And I ended up doing damage control for about 50 hours straight with no sleep, from the time I got up on Monday morning and saw that we were being reported in every kind of press just about, except for the very mainstream media, but all the tech press, all the geek press, all the blogs, as, you know, having been, you know, publishing child pornography in Germany, which we weren't. And it was just awful. So we have that kind of thing. And of course, Silk Road ran on Tor project software. They ran on the Hidden Services protocol, which is also...
Mostly hidden services.
Huh?
Mostly hidden services.
Mostly hidden services. Apparently they hadn't configured it correctly. Or at least that's the story that the FBI is saying. And it doesn't surprise me because hidden services is a mostly unfunded initiative and is sort of a semi-orphan project.
And CAPTCHAs suck anyway. And CAPTCHAs suck anyway.
Yeah, I don't know why, yeah, well, I don't know. CAPTCHAs are not a supported extension.
Right, and that was what leaked.
Yeah, and so.
It was badly configured.
It was not well configured, and it, you know, it's like what I said about using Flash. This is one of the things that I tell people is that I don't worry nearly so much about, you know, bad people using Tor, because my experience is that the people who are journalists and human rights workers and all this kind of stuff have, we were talking about operational security using PGP, and it takes some amount of discipline and thoughtfulness, mindfulness, and sober consideration to have the step-by-step discipline to deal with operational security. And my experience is that most criminal types in general have sort of a impulse control problem, that they don't have good OPSEC. And I saw this over and over again as Tor executive director, that the people who got caught by the law enforcement, by whatever security forces that, you know, we saw the forensics and things like that, the way that they got caught was because they did stupid things. And they did stupid things like, if they were child pornography types, the first thing that they did was they wanted to see Flash and Flash leaks. You know, and they didn't read the frigging manual. And the, you know, all of our stuff sits there and says, don't use Flash. It will leak your location. But what do? They load it up and they sit there and say, oh, we've got this magic amulet and it's called Tor, and so now we're safe. We don't have to read the damn manual. We're safe now. And we don't have to patch, we don't have to do anything. There was an incident a year or so ago where a bunch of people were caught on a child porn sting in Dublin. And how were they caught? They were caught because they were using Tor that was 3 to 6 months out of date, and therefore vulnerable to a code insertion that law enforcement used to decloak them. This is how law enforcement is able to find idiots. You know, they don't have good OPSEC because they aren't really paying attention. Really smart criminals often are not going to be the people who use Tor. They're going to use their own private VPNs. You know, there are private botnets that the Russian mafia and all sorts of other people use. It's much more secure than Tor, has much better performance than Tor. You know, they have their own ways of doing nefarious things that, you know, they don't have to bother with using Tor. Tor is probably, in a lot of ways, less secure than a private VPN because, you know, law enforcement knows where the Tor network is. They don't know where all of these other private networks are. They never see them. They don't see the entry points. They don't see the exit points. The entry and exit points that we have are not only published, but some of them are operated by law enforcement. And we know that. And everybody knows that. You know? So, and, you know, most of them are operated by volunteers and universities and you know, interested parties of other sorts. But the system is designed so you don't have to trust anybody in the network. But the real organized criminals, as it were, have better, more secure means to do stuff than using Tor. Some of them have figured out also how to use Tor just because, gee, they don't have to pay for it. But it's not the it wouldn't be, if I were, this may look like a black hat, but it's white. If it were really a black hat, I would not be using Tor. I would have much better means at my disposal. But basically, you know, today, I would say that the greatest threat to the Tor project would be the reputation war that is going on around it, having to do with contention in the United States and in the Middle East over if it's a good thing or not. And this is the curious thing that goes on in the press, you know, and the group may end up losing the support of the government in terms of its allies in government if the reputation succeeds in getting smeared enough. And we lose the hearts and minds, as it were. So that'll be interesting to watch in the next year or so. Questions? Yeah.
How big is the Tor network? How many entry nodes, intermediate nodes, exit nodes, just roughly?
Well, it depends on how you count. If you count bridges, it's thousands and thousands now. If you just count entry nodes, intermediate nodes, and exit nodes, I believe it's up to about 3,000, but I couldn't swear to that. I don't actually do a lot with the project these days. I actually had a stroke in 2007. That's why I left the project. So I'm a frequent, you know, I work a little bit of media contacts and things like that, but I don't do a lot technical with the group anymore.
Okay, so I got one other little question.
Sure.
If I'm using Tor to access a website somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and I do 5 interactions, 5 requests, is it likely that each will come out of a different exit node into the website, or is there a notion of a session so they'll go
No.
in the same route?
The default is that your network configuration will change every 10 minutes. So probably if you only have a few interactions, you're going to be within the same geometry. And there's some studied reasons that was considered to be pretty safe, you know, in terms of you know, not being traceable. And you can actually control that interval via the configuration file.
As a user or
As a
node?
user.
Oh, okay. Thank
Mhm.
you. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Bill Warren, I'm the editor of the Telecom Digest, and in that capacity, I'm sometimes called on to give advice to those who deal in a kind of what some people would consider child pornography. They deal in pictures of dead children lying in ditches and live ones lying naked on beds with shackles on their ankles. I need to know what assurances you can give me about Tor's effectiveness in keeping such people anonymous. Up till now, frankly, I've advised them to avoid any electronic means of communication at all. But of course, that has a price. Waste equivalent networks have tremendous lag times, and the effectiveness of the images they deal with is not very good for time. Any kind of atrocity has a very short half-life, and everybody's overwhelmed with stories of white slavery and all the other kinds of nastiness that some people choose to try to stop. What provisions can I make to, or recommend to people to make Tor a viable method for them to prevent them being included in government dragnets?
I think one of the best pieces of advice I can give you there is probably outside of network communications, which is for them to talk to law enforcement outside of their communications and say, you know, we are involved in this kind of advocacy, and these are not images which are, you know, these images have redeeming social value in that they are advocacy for, you know, this particular social end. And to be upfront about that so that it doesn't go around, it doesn't surprise anybody.
In some cases, the police officers put those bodies in the ditches. What then?
That's difficult. Do you have, you know, I don't know if you have people anywhere in the chain that you trust that you can talk to, because having somebody in that chain, in the chain of command who you could trust to talk to, who knows about that in advance, you know, would help if you ever end up with people coming after, you know. But it's, my dad worked with the SCLC when I was growing up, and, you know, generally it always helped to have somebody inside the organization who knew what was going on.
My acronym meter is broken. SCLC?
Sorry, the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition, Dr. King's organization, MLK, Martin Luther King. My dad worked night security on the Salem-Montgomery March and a bunch of the summer marches. And he was a Unitarian Universalist minister. And he organized local civil rights stuff during the year. So my early experience with surveillance was COINTELPRO and my parents telling me, you know, what to do if I was questioned and what to do if I heard that neighbors were questioned and what to do if they disappeared suddenly when and I got this from the age of 4. So it was kind of an interesting childhood. But like I said, this is a nation which has always been contentious, and within any organization, there are always people of different mindsets. And you will always have people who are going to be your advocates, even in the most hostile organizations. If it isn't going to be law enforcement, it'll be a judge, it'll be, you know, a committee person, it'll be somebody. If you can get somebody who is within the sphere of influence, who knows what you're doing, who can be like your advocate on the side, who knows before you end up in trouble, to come out and say, I knew that this was going on, and these people are not blah.
I don't want to monopolize the
Yeah.
meeting, but you're giving good political advice.
Well,
I'm
I've worked in
seeking-
politics, but you know,
I'm seeking technical advice, you see.
yeah.
It is not a good idea for me to know the people who obtain this material and send it. They are
The technical,
rather shy.
the technical advice, though, you know, the problem is that all the technical advice that I could give you, ultimately, the technical advice that I can give you is that no technical means of obscuring this sort of stuff is fail-safe. And you need to look at any particular problem of this sort in full context. And that's why I'm giving you political advice, because you can't look at these problems as being just technical problems. That's really, to a certain extent, why Tor was successful, was because we didn't treat it as an open source organization. We treated it as a human rights NGO that did software. You know, and you have to look at the problems in a whole context. Now, you can basically go on the Tor website and find resources for good OPSEC with Tor and all this kind of stuff. And I can't go into that detail here really anyway. But the best advice I can give you is to make sure that they're doing the best that they can in a full context and not just relying on tools, because it's really obvious these days that the ways of busting through these tools and around these tools is getting more and more sophisticated on a more and more general level. More questions?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.